Hey guys! Tonight we're traveling to the bustling, sun-soaked alleys of 14th century Venice. You're standing on a cobbled street at dawn, the smell of yeasty bread thick in the morning air, with wooden shutters creaking open above you, and church bells announcing yet another day of careful survival. Gondoliers glide silently down misty canals, unaware of the codes tucked into loaves of bread or the dagger hidden beneath a flour-dusted apron. The ovens are hot, but the work is colder than you'd expect. Because behind the facade of domestic life, of warm bread and neighborly nods, was an invisible world of surveillance, betrayal, and, occasionally, murder. And if you were chosen to walk that path, you probably wouldn't survive long enough to be remembered. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all listen from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He was called Il Fornaio, but he was never just a baker. His real name, or at least the one we find in scattered fragments of Venetian court records, was Marco Paterni. He ran a modest forno near the Rialto Bridge in the mid-1300s, an unassuming shop tucked between a fishmonger and a wax vendor. His bread was decent, not exceptional, but fresh, warm, enough to keep neighbors loyal. But his value to Venice wasn't in yeast. It was in silence. You see, Venice in the 14th century was a republic obsessed with survival. Caught between rival maritime powers like Genoa and the growing presence of the Ottomans, its strength came not just from fleets or fortresses, but from information. The Council of Ten, Venice's secretive ruling committee, relied on a dense wabblers, ebb of spies, informants, and double agents. And what better cover than a man who woke before dawn, spoke to every class of citizen, and delivered warm goods to guarded homes? Marco's induction into this shadowy world wasn't glamorous. It began, according to surviving records, with debt. He owed taxes. Not surprising. Venice had an intricate system of tariffs, licenses, and civic dues, many of which were difficult for lower tradesmen to keep up with. Marco, likely in his mid-30s, faced seizure of property. But rather than lose his forno, he was approached by a man from the Quarantia Criminal, the body that oversaw both legal enforcement and political secrecy. The offer was simple: keep your shop. But in exchange, you'll carry letters, you'll listen to conversations, you'll make observations, discreet, regular, and unpaid. And so began his real work. A morning in the life, Marco's day began at 3 o'clock a.m. The oven took time to heat, and deliveries to more influential clients had to arrive before midday. He worked alongside two apprentices, one of whom was deaf and thus trusted to overhear without understanding. Bread, rye, barley, and rare soft wheat rolls for upper-class homes was prepared in tight shifts. And every other day, nestled inside one of those loaves, Marco tucked a slip of paper no wider than a finger. These papers, often written in crude cipher, were destined for gondoliers working as Venetian informants. They'd swap the marked loaves at canal edges in silent exchanges that could be mistaken for casual commerce. The notes were mundane, sometimes laughably so. Observations about who visited the German warehouse, rumors from the docks about a new shipment of Eastern spices, whisperings of someone bribing a customs official. But occasionally, they contained fragments that shifted the city's decisions about trade, war, and assassination. The brilliance of this system was how invisible it was. Even Marco's apprentices likely didn't know. His wife, who died in childbirth years prior, had once run the front of the shop. Her absence only made his solitary life more discreet. And Marco, like so many unsung participants of espionage, was not particularly brave. He was cautious, nervous. His anxiety likely kept him alive longer than others. When flour turns to fire. In 1353, Venice was reeling from two crises: the failed Genoese blockade of the Adriatic and a particularly severe outbreak of plague in the city's outskirts. Both events made information more valuable than ever. It was during this tense period that Marco was tasked with something riskier. Not just notes, but observation of a diplomat. A Genoese merchant, Lorenzo di Spinola, had been granted temporary trading access to the city, ostensibly to negotiate tariffs. But Venice suspected he was planting informants, buying loyalties. Marco was instructed to tail him, discreetly, through alleys, into taverns, onto the bridges at dusk. This was different. Passive espionage is survivable, but direct tailing, risky. One evening, Marco followed Lorenzo to a tavern near San Polo. He sat 2 tables away, pretending to wait for a contact. What he didn't know was that Lorenzo had already made him. The details of what happened next come from a preserved report, anonymous naturally, filed with the Council of 10. Marco was approached by 2 men. One sat beside him and began to speak softly in Latin. The other stood behind, hands folded. "You sell bread," the man whispered, "but the hands that need dough should not reach into state affairs." Marco didn't respond, but he left the tavern immediately. He returned to his shop. That night, he didn't sleep. The following morning, he burned his flour notes. For 3 weeks, he sent no messages, only loaves. Third, Council of 10 noticed. A warning was issued, not in person, of course. A sealed note delivered by a courier boy slipped between sacks of flour. "Do not forget your duty. Venice sees all." He resumed his work, carefully, with less curiosity. But the fear never left him. The long middle. This is where Marco's life, and so many like his, becomes less dramatic but more telling. He didn't die in a violent clash. He didn't stab a rival in an alley. He baked, listened, delivered bread, hid messages, grew old, became slower, grew sick. By 1361, his name vanishes from the baker's guild rolls. A record in the Doge's archive notes the transfer of his shop to a younger man, possibly an apprentice. There's no gravestone, no pension, no portrait. Marco Paterni, the baker who spied for Venice for over 2 decades, likely died as quietly as he lived. But his role, small, mundane, sometimes tedious, was part of a massive engine of intelligence that allowed Venice to survive wars it shouldn't have, navigate threats it couldn't afford, and hold its delicate republic together through centuries of turmoil. And it forces us to wonder how many others like him existed, nameless and unnoticed, holding together the fragile threads of an empire through little more than careful silence and warm bread.
Venice, by the mid-14th century, was not just a city, it was a nervous system, a floating republic of trade, paranoia and paper, and at its core wasn't a doge or a golden fleet, but a bureaucratic machine so obsessed with information that it kept exhaustive ledgers on everything from the number of fishing nets used in Murano to the precise daily price of wax candles in Castello. Marco Paterni, our weary, flour-dusted informant, had become a functioning neuron in that system. Not a celebrated one, not even a trusted one if we're being honest, but one that remained for a time useful. Following his silent re-entry into the informant's life after the Lorenzo di Spinola scare, Marco's duties became more routine again. Less espionage, more courier work. He was never allowed to disappear entirely. Once you served the Council of 10, you never left, unless you stopped breathing. His routine became a metaphor for Venice itself, regular, meticulous, and quietly haunted. Surveillance, the Venetian way. To understand Marco's dull yet dangerous life, you have to understand the nature of surveillance in medieval Venice. Unlike other European powers that relied on brute force, Venice used paperwork like a scalpel. The Council of 10 and its network of secretaries, scribes, and intelligence gatherers managed an astonishing level of social control without most citizens even noticing. For example, the city was dotted with anonymous letterboxes called Bocce di Leone, the mouths of lions, carved into the walls of government buildings. Anyone could drop an accusation inside, reports of tax evasion, suspected treason, or even adultery among merchant families. Some were petty, many were false, but enough were true to justify their existence. Marco himself once used a lion's mouth to report a rival baker who had been selling week-old bread to naval quartermasters. It wasn't personal. He just needed the extra income from military contracts. The rival disappeared 3 weeks later. Marco never asked questions. And this is what life was like for those working quietly on the margins of power. Not quite assassins, not quite heroes. Just small cogs who learned quickly that to survive in Venice, you watched others carefully and kept your own mouth shut. The Great Grain Panic. In 1356, a curious event briefly brought Marco into sharper focus. That year, due to poor harvests in Dalmatia and mounting political tension with Hungarian forces inland, grain prices in Venice spiked dramatically. This wasn't just an economic issue, it was a matter of survival. Venice didn't grow its own grain. The marshy lagoon was not fertile ground. Instead, the Republic imported massive quantities of barley and wheat from its colonies and allies. A disruption in this supply chain wasn't just inconvenient. It meant riots, famine, unrest. And the Council of Ten believed, perhaps correctly, that someone was manipulating the supply to create instability. They turned to their information web, which by then included not only dock workers, scribes and innkeepers, but yes, bakers. Marco was asked to observe grain movements near the Arsenale and report inconsistencies in shipment times. Again, not glamorous, not dangerous, but sensitive. And as it turned out, he was useful. He noticed in late September that the schedule of offloaded grain barges had shifted quietly. Instead of arriving in the late morning when customs inspectors were most alert, a few barges had begun docking at dawn, or even just before. These early landings were not logged properly. The sacks of grain, not weighed. And the destination? Unclear. Marco's report, delivered in flour-covered parchment, kicked off a brief but intense investigation. Several mid-level port officials were arrested. A small-time grain merch, and named Tommaso di Braganza, who had ties to Genoa, was exiled to the island of Kirk. No formal thanks came Marco's way, of course, but 2 weeks later, a single sack of high-quality rye flour was delivered to his shop. No name, no note. He understood the message. Venice didn't praise you. It let you survive. The illusion of retirement. By 1360, Marco had grown tired. His hands, once quick with dough, were slower. Kneading caused pain in his knuckles. He had outlived most of his peers. His apprentices had married or moved on. The shop was quiet. He requested to be relieved from delivery duties, citing illness and the death of a distant cousin whose estate he now had to manage. This cousin may or may not have existed. The council, ever pragmatic, allowed the reduction of duties, but did not release him entirely. Instead, Marco was simply placed on a list of dormant observers. The message was clear. You're still one of ours. You're never not one of ours. That same year, the first stirrings of renewed war with Hungary reached Venice's inner chambers. Tensions were rising again. Spies were being reactivated. But Marco was left alone, for now. A man with no monuments. It's telling that for someone who served Venice faithfully for over 2 decades, there is no monument to Marco, no mention in chronicles, no statue in a niche. The only reason we know his story at all is due to scattered bureaucratic scraps, fines paid late, receipts for flour weights, and cross-referenced annotations in the secret minutes of the council. This was by design. Venetian informants were expendable. You were not remembered. You were not celebrated.
You were forgotten on purpose. Your survival was your reward. Marco, in his twilight, became a ghost while still alive. His final years were likely quiet. He may have taken in a new apprentice, passed on bread recipes, and told half-truths about the past. He probably never admitted how close he'd come to death, or how often he feared those early morning knocks at the door that never came. But once, for a while, this unremarkable baker had helped hold the floating empire together, not through bravery or cunning, but through silence. And that's what makes his story so quietly compelling. It wasn't about heroism, it was about endurance. The story of Marco Paterni asks a question we don't often consider. How many of history's greatest powers depended on people who were, frankly, just trying to avoid bankruptcy? Because sometimes the most influential people in an empire were the ones who didn't want to be noticed at all. And yet, even as Marco aged and faded from the active records, he remained useful in one way. He served as a case study for the council, an example of how long you could keep someone useful with just enough leverage, just enough fear, and just enough flour. But as the 1360s drew on and Venetian politics turned more violent, one final question lingered, like the smell of burnt crust in an empty oven. How long could someone like Marco stay forgotten before being erased entirely? The year was 1364, and Venice had grown more brittle. It had been over a decade since Marco Paterni last passed a cipher-laced loaf to a gondolier. By now, the grey in his beard was no longer peppered. His back hunched slightly from years of kneading dough, and he walked more slowly through the tight alleys of San Polo. The shop, his shop, still stood, but its pulse had slowed. Bread was no longer delivered but picked up. Clients came and went without gossip. The oven burned cooler, less often. The republic he had quietly served for nearly 25 years was changing too. Venice had survived yet another flare-up with Hungary, and now eyed the crumbling Byzantine territories to the east. Trade was threatened. Factionalism within the city began to rise again. The Doge, Lorenzo Kelsey, was an ambitious man, less cautious than his predecessors. The Council of Ten had grown paranoid, issuing new edicts about internal threats and external infiltration. And into this unstable moment, a ghost was pulled from the edge of silence. The apprentice's mistake. The final known incident involving Marco began, as many stories in Venice do, with a careless whisper in the wrong tavern. One of Marco's former apprentices, Matteo, barely in his 20s, flush with wine and naive bravado, allegedly mentioned his master's past work while boasting to a merchant's son. The comment was casual, a story half-remembered, perhaps exaggerated for effect. It was spoken near Campo San Giacomo, over cheap salted cod and too much red wine. The problem was that the merchant's son worked quietly for the Quarantia, and in Venice you didn't joke about service to the council, past or present. Within 3 days, Marco was summoned. Not by name, not with a trial. A sealed message arrived, marked with the council's wax sigil, 3 intersecting rings. Marco, reading the note alone in the back of his bakery, understood instantly what it meant. You are being remembered. The message gave a time, a location. No instructions, just expectation. At dawn, he left his keys on the counter and walked to the appointed room in the Doge's palace, through a servant's entrance, through narrow corridors to a small chamber with no windows and only one chair. He sat. No names were exchanged. A masked man, a common practice to protect the council's inner identity, asked Marco 3 questions. Had he spoken of his duties? Had he kept any records? Was he still loyal? Marco answered simply, no, no, yes. Then silence, a pause longer than comfort allowed. Finally, the masked man spoke. You are to remain still. Your voice remains unwelcome. Speak of these duties again, and you will be made to sleep. Marco understood this too. He bowed once and was escorted out. No punishment, no imprisonment, just a reminder. Silence is a condition of survival. But from that moment forward, he lived differently. The final years, no records survive of Marco after 1365. His shop was sold in 1367 to a man named Paolo, possibly Matteo's cousin. The bill of sale lists the property as functionally intact but aged. The oven was still operational, the front counter still stood, but Marco himself is absent from the transaction. He may have died, or he may have vanished. Venice had ways of removing people without spectacle. A late-night boat, a quiet exile, a fall into the canal, or perhaps most common of all, simple obscurity. If he died naturally, it would have been alone, perhaps in his sleep, perhaps in the back of his shop, dusted in flour, still dreaming of heat and dough and silence. But whether by natural decay or enforced disappearance, his story closes quietly, just as the council would have wanted. Why it mattered. You might wonder why a man like Marco, who never assassinated anyone, never veered a great conspiracy and never even left his city, matters at all. But Marco is the reason empires endure. Not because he was clever, but because he was ordinary and reliable. Because he did what he was told. Because he asked no questions. Because he worked in silence, under threat and poverty, for just enough reward to keep going. And Venice, that shimmering republic of masks and marble, of gold leaf and secret prisons, required thousands of Marcos to survive. The baker spy, the dockside informant, the tavern eavesdropper, the widow who copied letters for the notary and quietly tracked names. We remember the doges. We remember the wars. But we forget the flower-covered hands that carried the state's secrets under the crust of everyday life. Marco's story also reminds us that survival in history often belonged not to the boldest, but to the quietest. He didn't rise. He didn't fall dramatically. He endured until he couldn't. And that's the quietly brutal truth of so many historical lives. We think of spies and assassins as men with cloaks, poison rings and thrilling escapes. But often they were just people like Marco, tired, scared, and still bound to serve because the alternative was worse. And maybe at the end, Marco felt some pride. Or maybe not. Maybe he just wanted to bake bread and be left alone. But the empire had already claimed him. And so we close this first story of why it sucked to be a medieval assassin, not with a bang or blade, but with the quiet sigh of a man who knew too much, said too little, and lived exactly as long as Venice needed him to. Now, let's move onward. Our next tale will bring us south into the shadowed kitchens and quiet rooms of Avignon, where women used powder, plants, and perfect politeness to poison their way through history. Story 2. Poison in the Pantry. The Silent Women of Avignon. The narrow alleys of 14th century Avignon smelled of stewed onions, wet cobblestone, incense, and rot. Inside the cloistered homes, especially those closest to the river, the kitchens were always slightly damp, mildew creeping along the floorboards, drying herbs hung from beams above, and something always boiling, broth, lye, or vinegar, depending on whether it was a meal or a mess being cleaned. At the heart of this sleepy city, in the shadow of the papal palace, a different kind of survival was being practiced. Not with swords or spies, but with cinnamon, arsenic, and patience. Because this story isn't about men in dark cloaks, it's about women in aprons, and the slow, deliberate work of domestic quietude, sometimes fatal, always overlooked. Avignon, papal capital and powdered secrets. From 1309 to 1377, Avignon was the seat of the papacy, a curious period in history when the Pope didn't live in Rome but in southern France. The city swelled with clerics, bureaucrats, cooks and merchants, all drawn to the court of Clement V and his successors. What followed was predictable.
corruption, luxury, and a thick layering of quiet discontent. Beneath the gilded halls and holy pretense, Avignon was a city of survival. And for many women, especially those without powerful husbands or wealthy fathers, life came down to the domestic arts: cooking, cleaning, midwifery, and, if you were clever and quiet, the apothecary arts. Not openly, of course, but subtly. Because knowledge of herbs could heal, and knowledge of the same herbs could do much, much more. Who were these women? Most of the women we'll explore in this story don't have full names. That's not because they were unimportant, but because they were, by necessity, invisible. Their names were rarely written. Their confessions, if made, were often burned. But we knows. They existed because of ecclesiastical court records, inquisitorial reports, and one particularly curious inventory of seized household goods from 1348. Among the names we do have, one appears again and again: Isabeau. Isabeau was a common Provençal name at the time, short for Isabel, but several Isabeaus appear in connection with domestic poisons and whispered accusations. Whether they were the same woman or several practitioners remains debated. What matters more than their identity is their pattern. They were typically housekeepers, widows, cooks for minor clerics, occasionally midwives or caretakers, always women who had access to food and to the bodies of others. And they were dangerous in a way that no one expected. The kitchen as a battlefield. If you imagine medieval poisoning as dramatic goblets of wine foaming with green liquid, think again. In Avignon, it was much more subtle and often indistinguishable from bad hygiene. Most common poisonings involved food already expected to be unsafe: stew, meat pies, warm milk. With no refrigeration, the line between illness and malice was thin. A poorly stored roast could kill, but so could a ground seed slipped into the spices. The most common substances used were arsenic, white and tasteless when properly refined, often mixed with vinegar to dissolve into liquid; monkshood, aconite, extracted into tinctures, common in herb gardens; mandrake root, used both as sedative and as poison, depending on dosage; cantharides, Spanish fly, actually beetle resin, painful and not always fatal but effective; powdered glass, crude but deadly in digestive tracts, especially mixed in ground black pepper. The trick wasn't the poison, it was the timing. These women, who'd spent their lives measuring yeast and slicing turnips, knew their kitchens better than anyone. They understood how long to steep a broth before it too seasoned, how to disguise bitterness with strong rosemary, how to create a delay so the death seemed unconnected to the meal. This wasn't crime born of malice. Often it was survival, motivations and morality. One might ask, why would someone kill a papal scribe, a wine merchant, or a visiting nephew? But if you were a woman in 14th century Avignon, the real question was, why wouldn't you? There were few legal protections. Marriage was binding. Abuse was common. Widows often lost their property to distant male relatives. A woman accused of impropriety could be cast out with no recourse. But if a cruel husband fell ill and died, well, that was simply God's will. And so, many of these poisonings were not political. They were personal: an abusive master, a lecherous bishop, a violent brother-in-law. Others were transactional. Several women were paid in coins or cloth to prepare corrective potions for others. One record from 1343 mentions Isabeau la Petite receiving 6 sous for delivering a small jar of cleansing tonic to a merchant's wife. The wife notably survived. Her husband did not. Sometimes they simply wanted control. When all you owned was a pot, a few dried herbs, and your reputation, the ability to decide who lived or died, quietly, unseen, was a kind of power unimaginable in the official world. The Inquisition's blind spot. Now, you might expect the Papal Inquisition to be all over this, but here's the thing.
They weren't. At least not at first. While witchcraft was occasionally cited in accusations, the medieval church was more concerned with heresy, doctrinal deviation, than personal malice. So unless a poisoner confessed to dealing with demons or using forbidden knowledge, the church often handed such cases to secular courts, which were remarkably bad at handling them. Evidence was hard to come by. Witnesses were unreliable. Poison was nearly impossible to trace. So most accusations went unpunished. Until the plague came. The Black Death changes everything. In 1348, Avignon was hit hard by the Black Death, up to half Demain.
His city's population died in less than a year. Pope Clement VI famously consecrated the entire Rhone River to act as a mass burial ground. The city became a cloud of incense and silence, and in times of chaos, suspicion grows. Suddenly, herbalists became suspects. Cooks were watched more closely. Any woman known to deal in powders or teas found herself at risk. Because when everyone is dying, and you know how to handle plants, you must be involved, right? A new wave of investigations began, but not because there was proof of poisoning, simply because the line between illness and intention had vanished. We have records of at least 5 women executed between 1350 and 1360 in Avignon on charges of unnatural influence over illness. None were proven poisoners. All were midwives or herbalists. Isabeau, if she survived, likely vanished during this time, into exile, deeper into domestic anonymity, or into the river with the rest. We will never know. But her story, and the stories of the women like her, survived in the margins. And those margins are where the history of quiet assassins is often written. A soft ending. So here we are. We began in a kitchen, with spoons and spice. We walked into the lives of forgotten women who stirred their way into survival. And we end with a question. When history is written by scribes who eat, but not by those who cook, how much have we lost? The women of Avignon didn't see themselves as villains. They were caretakers, forced into control. Their poisonings weren't always out of hate. Sometimes they were born of necessity, despair, or simply a quiet resolve that no one else would help. In a world that gave them no power, they found one, and they used it, sparingly, carefully, and often fatally. So the next time you open a spice jar and breathe in something sharp and ancient, remember, somewhere long ago, a quiet woman in a cold kitsy, Hen was doing the same. And she wasn't cooking dinner. She was changing the course of a very small piece of history. Next time, we'll move deeper into this hidden world, into the second section of Poison in the Pantry, where we'll look at a particularly chilling case of a woman who survived 3 inquisitions, 2 husbands, and left behind a curious cookbook filled with remedies, recipes, and warnings. The second part of this tale begins with a discovery made centuries after the fact, beneath a crumbling chapel wall in Carpentras, a town just east of Avignon. During minor renovations in 1891, a workman found a false panel near a bricked-off root cellar. Behind it, an iron-studded chest, mostly rotted through. Inside, among broken spoons and shards of pottery, was a book, small, thick, leather-bound, water-damaged. No title, no date, just page after page of neat handwriting in Old Provençal. It was catalogued as a curiosity and quietly donated to the Bibliothèque Anguimbertine, where it sat, unread and mislabeled, for nearly 50 years. It was only in the 1940s, during a translation project on medieval apothecaries, that the book's contents were finally transcribed. Its pages offered a strange hybrid, part herbal manual, part kitchen log, part coded testimony. And in the margins, again and again, a single name appeared. Isabeau. Was it the same woman as before? Or someone honoring a tradition? It hardly matters. What we found was a record of knowledge, illicit, detailed, and undeniably dangerous. What was in the book? The manuscript, now referred to simply as the Book of Isabeau, contains over 140 entries. Some are unmistakably benign, instructions for preserving figs, making lavender water, or curing coughs with honeyed milk. Others, less so. Here are just a few examples. Entry 23. To make a husband still his hand, mix dried lily of the valley with warm cider. It will calm the rage. Do not exceed 2 doses. Entry 41. If a man grows violent, powder root of hellebore and steep with sour wine. 2 sips for pain in the gut, 4 for sleep that deepens. Entry 88. To end the cycle of beatings, brew foxglove with ground plum pits. Serve with sweet clove. The body will fail slowly, as if God intended it. The writing is not emotional. It is clinical, calm. Detach. But there are warnings too. Some herbs are for death only. Others are to weaken but not break. Many entries include small notations like works better on empty stomach or don't serve near witnesses. But perhaps most chilling is the final page. It contains a simple note, scribbled in faded ink. If they find this, I am already ash. And that, more than anything else, tells you what kind of world this was. A life in shadows. So who was this Isabeau? Let's look at what we can reconstruct. According to ecclesiastical records from 1339, a woman named Isabeau de Mornus was questioned during an inquisition into non-sanctioned female healing. She was accused of using ungodly mixtures to interfere with divine will, a phrase that could mean anything from midwifery to sedatives. She was not imprisoned, but was ordered to confess and cease her work. She did not. In 1342, she appears again, this time as a witness in a domestic abuse hearing involving a minor cleric and his wife. Isabeau testified that the woman had suffered 6 bloodings of the lip and 2 breaks of the rib. The case was dismissed. The husband was reassigned. The wife disappeared. Isabeau vanished from the record for 6 years. In 1348, at the height of the plague, a woman matching her description, older, sharp tongue, wears a red sash, was seen distributing herbal charms outside the city wall. One witness claimed she used smoke and ash to ward spirits. She was interrogated again, but spared, as many healers were during the crisis, due to desperation. After that, there is only silence. We do not know when she died. We do not know where she was buried, but the book suggests she lived long enough to write, test, and refine over 100 compounds. And if even a third of them were successful, she altered the lives of dozens, perhaps hundreds. Some she saved, some she silenced, and so, Omé, we suspect she set free, by ending those who held them captive. Power in a clay pot. It's easy to overlook the significance of a kitchen. It's just a place where things boil, brown, and burn. But for women like Isabeau, it was the only room in the house where they had full authority. In the dining hall, men spoke. In the bedroom, men ruled. But in the kitchen, the woman decided what went into the body and what came out of it. She knew what was fresh, what was spoiled, what was safe, and what was not. The men of Avignon, clothed in velvet and gold, with their religious titles and legal protections, never thought to fear the cook. She was invisible, humble, harmless, until she wasn't. And even then, they rarely knew it. Recipes and remedies, or weapons. Historians have debated how to categorize the Book of Isabeau. Is it a cookbook, a pharmacological record, a covert manual for domestic assassination? The answer is likely all 3. Take entry 55, for example. It's titled, "To Soothe the Tongue of an Angry Child." It recommends a mixture of warm goat's milk,
crushed poppy seed, and lavender syrup. But in the margin, a second note, almost as an afterthought, reads, "With double seed and half measure less milk, it silences all." Silences all. Not just the tongue, not just the child. It's this duality that defines the entire manuscript. Each entry reads like a choice, a fork in the road. Add this, heal. Add that, harm. And always with the implication, you decide. Quiet networks, we have evidence that the Book of Isabeau was not a lone project. In one entry, she references a gift from Hélène in Pont Saint-Esprit, and another time mentions Bee of Arles, who confirm the roots grow truer in shadow. These names, mostly initials or nicknames, suggest a network of women sharing information across towns under the guise of trade or family visits. It's entirely possible that there were dozens of women keeping similar records, testing ingredients and passing notes like recipes. After all, sharing medicinal remedies was common, but some shared more than cough syrup. They shared strategy. There's even reason to believe that one strand of this network reached into the kitchens of Avignon's minor seminaries, where a series of suspicious fevers took out several low-ranking clerics between 1351 1353. None of these deaths were investigated. But one woman, listed only as Marie Ladouce, was transferred from seminary cook to a convent kitchen immediately afterward. A coincidence? Or just another spoon in the pantry? The danger of silence. Isabeau's story, real or compiled, ends as many women's stories do in medieval Europe, with uncertainty. We do not know how she died. We do not know if she ever faced true justice, or if she deserved to. But we do know this: her work survived her, and for centuries, long after the smoke of the plague cleared, long after Avignon returned to obscurity, that quiet little book sat in the dark, filled with warnings and whispers. It's easy to forget the power that lives in silence, in patience, in repetition. But if you've ever felt helpless, if you've ever felt like the world is built to ignore your pain, remember that once, long ago, a woman in a smoky kitchen turned her knowledge into a kind of justice, and no one noticed until it was far too late. What comes next? In the final part of this story, we'll step further into the shadows, exploring how the memory of women like Isabeau gave rise to something larger, the early seeds of the witchcraft panic, and how herbalists and midwives were transformed in the public eye from helpers to heretics. We'll also look at how domestic knowledge became feared knowledge, and how quietly preparing a tonic for a stomachache could get you burned alive. It's not a happy ending. But then again, none of these are. When did healing become heresy? That question doesn't have a tidy answer. But to understand how women like Isabeau, once valued for their knowledge of roots, tinctures, and household remedies, became objects of fear, we must look at what came next. The 15th century wave of suspicion, denunciation, and death that swallowed women across Europe under the banner of witchcraft. And it all begins with a shift in authority, away from what people knew through tradition and toward what they were told by doctrine. Isabeau's time, mid-14th century, was still a twilight era for folk medicine. Local wisdom still held sway in villages and kitchens. But over the next 100 years, the ground shifted. Literacy increased. Universities rose. And most importantly, the Church solidified its role not just as spiritual authority, but as the gatekeeper of knowledge itself. That meant only certain people were allowed to heal, only certain remedies were sanctioned, and only certain intentions were considered pure. If you healed outside those rules, even successfully, you invited danger, especially if you were a woman. From wise women to witches, before there were witches, there were wise women, cunning folk, herb wives, midwives. They made poultices for burns, helped with difficult labors, and yes, sometimes offered more controversial services, like contraceptives or abortifacients. These were often tolerated, especially in rural areas, as long as they didn't draw attention or conflict with the local priest. But by the late 1400s, Europe saw an explosion in witchcraft prosecutions. The Spark, a little book called Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors. It argued, in no uncertain terms, that women were more susceptible to demonic influence, that herbal remedies were a cover for malevolent magic, and that silence, secrecy, and female no's were not virtues, but threats. Suddenly, a woman who could make a man sleep through the night with a tincture wasn't just clever. She was suspicious. If he never woke up, she was damned. A new kind of trial. Unlike earlier inquisitions that focused on heresy or blasphemy, the witchcraft trials were deeply personal. They often began with accusations from neighbors, not clergy. A cow that died, a child who fell ill, a husband who lost his strength. And behind each accusation was a woman who, in some way, had stepped outside the narrow lines of obedience. Often they were old, poor, widowed, but not always. Sometimes they were simply too clever, too quiet, or too helpful in ways that couldn't be explained by prayer alone. The authorities turned their gaze on kitchens and gardens, on clay pots, dried bundles, and smoke-wreathed hearths. And there, in those unassuming spaces, they found their targets. One of the most damning pieces of evidence? A book. Not a spell book necessarily, but a private record. A ledger of recipes, treatments, or seasonal remedies, just like the Book of Isabeau. Because writing for a woman was power, and power had become criminal. Names in the margin, among the many inquisitorial records from Avignon between 1450 and 1490, at least 3 include references to a book of household cures, or the red recipes. The color red, associated with blood, with sin, with female bodies, became a dangerous thing. One trial, held in 1473, accused a woman named Marguerite of hiding a herb ledger behind her chimney stones. She claimed it was a family cookbook. They burned her anyway. Another woman, called Agnès de Sarian, was convicted after authorities found a diary with entries noting which herbs she gave to her sister for monthly pains. No poisons were ever found. But one of the entries matched a case of sudden death in the same household. 2 years prior, she was hanged. In one of the records, a note scribbled in Latin includes a rare phrase, Isabeau's daughters multiply. It is not clear whether this refers to literal descendants or metaphorical ones, those who carried her knowledge forward. But the implication was unmistakable. The legacy of silent women, once tolerated or ignored, was now considered a contagious threat. Burning the pantry. By the end of the 15th century, France, and much of Europe, had become a dangerous place for women who knew too much. Authorities began rooting out old apothecary traditions, shuttering informal midwife networks, and criminalizing the sharing of unauthorized treatments. In some regions, merely possessing dried belladonna or mandrake root, both common in traditional medicine, was enough to warrant suspicion. Kitchens, once sacred spaces of warmth and nourishment, became associated with shadow and secrecy. Pots were turned over, herbs confiscated, family books burned, and so much of that quiet knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter for generations, was lost in the smoke. It was not just women who were destroyed. It was a way of life. Legacy in the ash. Yet, as history often does, pieces survived. We know that the Book of Isabeau was copied at least twice in the late 14th century. One version, incomplete, turned up in Marseille in the early 1600s, its recipes disguised as poetry. Another fragment was found in the archives of a Scottish convent, suggesting the knowledge may have travelled far beyond Provence. And the original? It's now in the archives of the Bibliothèque Ingimbertine, sealed in a climate-controlled case. Most scholars avoid it. It's not a flashy text, no incantations, no demons, just dry ink on yellowing vellum. But inside those pages lies something remarkable, the quiet record of a woman who found power in the simplest place, her pantry. She never raised a sword, she never led a rebellion, but she changed her world. One spoonful at a time. The final thought, its tea. Tempting to look back and ask whether Isabeau was a hero or a villain. Was she a healer who helped women escape abusive men? Was she a poisoner who took justice into her own hands? Or was she something else entirely? An ordinary woman who did what she had to do in a world that gave her no protection? We'll never know for sure. But the question still echoes through time. How many lives were spared because one woman dared to write them down? And how many more were lost when the world told her to be silent? Story 3. The Bureaucrat of Famine. How grain became power in 14th century Florence. By now you're probably curled deep under your covers, your limbs heavy, your breath slowing, as the hum of the fan blends with the cadence of this strange little history. We've walked shadowed kitchens in Avignon and crept through alleyways with silent knives in the dark. Now we shift, just slightly east, just slightly earlier, to Florence in the late 1300s. The wind is drier here. The buildings are taller, more deliberate. There's no scent of herbs in the air, just stone and sweat and the distant crackle of forge fire. And while most eyes of history turn toward Florence's artists, popes and bankers, we focus tonight on someone far more mundane, a man with a key, a man who counted sacks of grain line by line, a man whose pen, not sword, kept tens of thousands alive during one of the darkest years in Florentine memory. His name was Matteo di Spinello, and in 1374 he was appointed Deputato del Grano, the grain deputy of Florence. And no one cared. Until the food ran out. The man who counted wheat. There's little written about Matteo. He wasn't famous. He wasn't particularly bright. What he was, reliably, was careful. He kept ledgers with alarming detail. One notebook in the Archivio di Stato lists every grain delivery between April and July of 1374, with tallies down to the handful. He recorded things like number of guards on duty during unloading, the dryness of burlap sacks, which mules appeared nervous on arrival. Why? No one knows. But he did it every day. He took his job seriously, obsessively. Because to Matteo, grain was not just food. It was safety, currency, leverage. In a city of silk merchants and guild masters, Matteo was a pencil pusher with the fate of the poor under his fingernails. And for a few terrible weeks in 1374, he may have been the most important man in Florence. The warning signs. In the spring of that year, the rains came late. The wheat fields outside Lucca and Volterra shriveled. Riverbeds cracked. The surrounding villages sent word to Florence, prepare for a hard season. But the wealthy didn't listen. They never do. Florence was fed by a complex system of contracts and imports. Barges brought grain up the Arno River. Caravans rolled in from Pisa and Arezzo. It had been this way for decades, but Matteo saw something no one else bothered to notice. In his ledgers, the average shipment size had been dropping for months. The dates between deliveries were stretching. The caravans were slower. The grain itself was lighter, drier, dustier. His notes for May 14, 1374, include this line. Grain weak, 1/3 hollow husk. Bakers unsatisfied. Recommend emergency reserve withdrawal, denied. He had already made his request. Unlock the second storehouse. It held over 2,000 barrels of grain. Florence's insurance. But only the Signoria, the city council, could authorize it. And they wouldn't.
Why? Because it was May. The market stalls were still full. The nobles had bread. The problem, as always, belonged to the poor. A slow collapse. By mid-June, things changed. The bread grew darker, rougher. It had bark, acorns, even ground chestnuts. Bakers began diluting flour with crushed beans. People noticed. There were fights in the line, whispers of hoarding. Matteo noted. 1717. June. 2 arrests at Porta San Nicolo for selling mouldy grain at noble price. 1 woman struck with a boot. Fainting common in queue. He submitted 3 more formal petitions to the council. All were ignored. Then came July the 3rd. A full barge from Pisa arrived completely empty. Looted, its guards killed outside Castelfranco. The council convened in emergency session. Finally, Matteo was given the key. The storehouse, the emergency grain store. He was kept in a low stone building just off the Mercato Vecchio. Its door had a triple lock, 1 for the council, 1 for the city treasurer, and 1 for Matteo. They all gathered that morning to unlock it. The ceremony was formal. There were records to sign, witnesses to call. But when the great wooden door finally creaked open, the smell inside stopped them cold. Rot. The sacks were damp. Mice had gotten in. A slow leak in the roof had turned nearly half the barrels to slime. No one said anything for a full minute. Then the shouting began. Fists slammed against tables. The treasurer blamed the roofers. The council blamed the guards. And Matteo? He said nothing. Instead, he walked the length of the storehouse, opened 21 of the least damaged barrels, and ordered their contents distributed within the hour. It wouldn't be enough, but it was something. The ledger as weapon, from that day, Matteo became more than a clerk. He began enforcing ration rules with religious precision. Each household received exactly what it needed. No more, no less. He created a citywide stamp system. Every bag of grain issued bore his mark, a crescent over a circle. He appointed 3 assistants, none from noble families. He refused bribes. When the Bakers' Guild accused him of favoritism, he responded by shutting down their ovens for 24 hours. The record shows, Anton July, attempted bribe by Girolamo dei Donati, offered 4 ducats, declined, threatened, banned his name from ration queue. May God forgive me. He began walking the lines himself, talking to mothers, bakers, porters. He tracked symptoms of malnutrition in children. He learned the names of all 71 bakery apprentices in the city. He even started sleeping inside the granary. For 2 months he kept Florence fed. Barely. And then, on August 28th, it rained. Hard, steady. By late September, the harvest returned. Slowly, quietly, the famine eased. The aftermath, Matteo did not celebrate. His final ledger entries are shorter, wearier. One reads simply, bread returned, but I do know. See, taste it. He was dismissed from his post in October. Not punished, just replaced by someone more politically connected. No statue was ever built for him. His name vanished from records a decade later. There are no paintings, no songs, just the ledgers and a key. Today, if you visit Florence's state archives, tucked deep in the dusty folios of the grain office, you'll find them. Pages and pages of exacting numbers, ratios, and notes in faded ink. One line, dated August 3rd, 1374, says this: "If I measure wrong, people will die. If I measure right, no one will notice." History didn't notice, but we will. Because sometimes the most boring people, the ones with pens, not swords, are the ones who quietly save a city from starving itself to death. Florence, autumn of 1374. The city breathed again, slowly, cautiously. The rains had returned, bringing with them the promise of a modest harvest. Wheat prices dropped. Bread returned to the markets in more familiar forms, lighter, fluffier, white-rinded, and infused with hope. But what hope existed for Matteo di Spinello? The man who'd once stood at the heart of Florence's survival now sat on a small stool in a back office, reclassified as a low-ranking notary for the Wool Guild. He still brought his ledgers, still wrote too much, but no one read them. No ceremony marked his departure, no public thanks, not even a bonus. That wasn't how Florence worked. Florentine politics, especially in the 14th century, were notoriously fickle. Honor came in brief flashes, quickly swallowed by routine. A man like Matteo, who operated outside patronage networks, who made decisions based on what was right rather than what was expected, found himself unmoored. But what's more interesting than his fall is what followed it. Because the famine didn't end cleanly, and in its wake came something even more dangerous than hunger: division. The blame games. As the city stabilized, questions began to swirl in its council chambers. Who had allowed the emergency reserves to rot? Why had the council waited so long to release them? Where had all the emergency funds gone? Of course, when powerful men ask questions, they don't really want answers. They want scapegoats. And Matteo, despite his service, or perhaps because of it, had become a problem. He had issued grain stamps without noble approval. He had kept personal ledgers outside of official accounting channels. He had turned away influential families in favor of beggars. For a few tense weeks in November, it looked as if he might be brought up on charges: misuse of state resources, falsification of distribution records, even acting outside the will of the signoria. But the case never went to trial. Why? Because his ledgers were impeccable. Every stamp logged. Every name matched to weight, to address, to day of week. Even the smallest discrepancies were footnoted with comments like, "Family of 6, infant died August 12th, reduced allotment accordingly." There was no fraud, no theft, just ink, parchment, and a level of order that made Florence's own clerks look sloppy by comparison. Instead of a trial, he was quietly reassigned, moved to wool inventory. Some say it was a kindness, others say it was exile. For Matteo, it was a kind of death. A new crisis, a new deputy. In 1376, 2 years after the famine, another dry spring loomed. Panic stirred, not at the same scale, but enough for murmurs to rise. This time, the council acted faster. A new deputy of grain was installed, Bernardo degli Altoviti, a respected merchant with deep ties to the Albizzi and Medici factions. He dressed well. He spoke well. He understood politics. He also had no experience with grain. To his credit, Bernardo tried to centralize the system. He created a single-point distribution plan, storing all Florence's food reserves under the guard of the elite Capitani di Parte Guelfa. But he ignored local cues. He relied on contracted distributors. He dismissed untrained help, especially people like Matteo. His system lasted 6 months. Then one morning in July, 3 delivery carts never arrived. They hadn't been attacked. They'd simply been misrouted by a clerk. Over the next 2 days, 3 bakeries shut down for lack of flour. There was no famine, not this time. But the fear came back, sharp and sudden. And with it, the people remembered the quiet man with the ledgers. The paper revolt. There was no protest, no riot. What happened next is, by all accounts, one of the most unassuming acts of publics.
Dissent in 14th century Florence. Over the course of 1 week in August 1376, dozens of people began writing Matteo's symbol, a crescent over a circle, on the doors of local bakeries. Some etched it into walls. Others marked it on receipts, as if to say, "We remember." Bernardo took it as an insult and ordered all marked establishments investigated. That backfired. Bakers refused to cooperate. Merchants smirked behind their hands. The mark wasn't just nostalgia. It was a quiet call for something rare in Florence: fairness. Eventually, the council intervened. Bernardo's grain policies were loosened, local queues reintroduced. Matteo's ledgers, yes, the old ones, were copied and studied for procedural insight. Matteo himself, he wasn't reinstated. He didn't want to be. But something changed in him. He began mentoring young clerks. He invited apprentices from poor families to learn record-keeping. He no longer needed power. He had process. The grain ledger that survived the plague. In 1381, Matteo died of an intestinal illness, probably unrelated to plague, though records are vague. He left behind a modest estate: 2 ledgers, 3 wax seals, a chipped ceramic grain weight, and a small wooden box. Inside that box were 41 hand-inked ration stamps. They were never used. They weren't valuable. No one tried to steal them. But the box itself passed hands, quietly, discreetly, for centuries. Florentine archivists mention it in footnotes as late as 1709. It surfaces again in 1891 in the personal collection of a Tuscan historian who referred to it only as Il Pacco del Silenzioso, the quiet man's bundle. Today, it's on display in a tiny case at the Museo di Palazzo d'Avanzati. Most visitors skip it. But if you lean close behind the glass, you'll still see that faded mark etched into wood. A crescent, a circle, a man with no title, no statue, just a system. And for a city like Florence, that was enough. The open ending. In a world where power often shouts, Matteo whispered. And yet, his whisper fed a city. So we ask, how many other cities starved, not for lack of food, but for lack of someone who cared enough to count? Let's drift forward now, not quickly, but steadily, like dust through the late morning air of a Florentine workshop. It's the year 1392, nearly 2 decades after the famine of 74. Florence has grown. Its walls have been reinforced. Its churches are fuller. Its merchant houses pulse with gold-backed contracts, shipping records and textile orders. The grain markets? Still humming, still political. But in the back rooms of the city's chancery, among piles of accounting forms and tax rosters, something small, almost imperceptible, is happening. Young scribes are being trained differently. They're taught to document not only transactions, but impact. Ledgers now include margins for contextual notes. Clerks begin recording not just how much, but who received what and why. This, whether they admit it or not, is the fingerprint of Matteo di Spinello. A man who never authored a treatise, never founded a guild, never climbed into the echelons of Florentine wealth. And yet, here his influence lingers, not in bronze or marble, but in the practices of men who, like him, believed that order could be a form of mercy. This is where our story closes. Not with a dramatic ending, but with an ongoing echo, barely audible but enduring. Let's pull gently on that thread. The rise of the clerk class. You see, one unintended consequence of the famine, and of Matteo's strict, morally grounded method of distribution, was the rise in perceived importance of clerical workers. Before the crisis, scribes were seen as functionaries, interchangeable, forgettable. But afterward, grain deputies and notaries began taking on larger civic roles. Some even entered politics. In 1383, a former record keeper was elected to the priorate. By 1390,
Florence had formalized a new category of civic training for logica e amministrazione, a kind of proto-bureaucratic school. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even particularly popular. But it laid the groundwork for Florence's administrative backbone in the 15th century. None of it bore Matteo's name. But the style of record-keeping, the ration fairness doctrine, the idea that a poor household had as much right to survival as a merchant one, all lifted from the man with no official title. A system remembered. During the 1400s, the Grain Office underwent multiple reforms. New deputies came and went. Records grew thicker, more complex. Still, tucked within official guidelines, a curious phrase appears again and again. Distribuzione secondo il criterio di bisogno e stabilità. Distribution according to need and stability. That phrase is lifted nearly word for word from Matteo's 1374 famine ledgers. His stamp, the crescent and circle, was never used officially again. But it started appearing as a kind of shorthand among apprentice scribes, a quiet signature added in inkless pressure at the bottom corner of well-balanced forms. It became a silent badge of honor. There are records of scribes being scolded for using it. Others proudly left it on documents that traveled across guilds, through the silk markets, even to Rome. By 1425, it had become almost mythological, a whisper of a standard, not enforced by law, but by memory. A memory that said, you are responsible for what you count. You do not hide behind numbers. You serve the stomach, not the purse. Bread riots and the cost of forgetting, but Florence, like all cities, forgot. In 1431, a grain shortage swept across Tuscany again. This time it wasn't caused by drought, but by war. Merchant routes to the south were blocked. The price of wheat soared. The current grain deputy, a man named Ser Ugo delle Torri, was a political appointee. He implemented price caps but not distribution controls. He trusted the market to balance itself. It didn't. Riots broke out in the Santo Spirito quarter. A baker's apprentice was killed when a stall was looted. The Medici dispatched guards to restore order, but it was too late. Bread had become a symbol again, not just of survival, but of failure. And once again, people began scratching strange little shapes into doors. A crescent, a circle. When questioned, one rioter reportedly said, "It's from the famine. It means someone gave a damn." Florentine officials rolled their eyes. The symbol was dismissed as folklore, but they reopened the old famine ledgers, quietly, privately. They began training their next generation of clerks on what Matteo's distribution maps had taught. Reserves mean nothing if they're not given at the right time. History, it seems, has a short memory, but ledgers thankfully do not. Legacy in ink, not stone. What is legacy? For Matteo di Spinello, it wasn't children. He never married. It wasn't buildings. He owned nothing beyond a rented apartment near the Ponte alla Carraia. It wasn't written philosophy or grand architectural dreams. It was a ratio, a method, a soft-spoken insistence that systems should protect people, not simply count them. Even the most generous historians barely mention his name. The Archivio di Stato files him under functionary. But there's something deeply human in the way his story unfolds. He saw suffering. He used ink and order to meet it. He was punished for his diligence. And long after his death, when the city once again reached for balance, it reached for his work. Not for glory, not for ideology, but because it worked. And it worked because it cared. The open ending. So as we close this third tale under a sky of low Florentine stars, let me ask, how many invisible hands have kept history turning? Not with banners or battles, but with ledgers, stamps and grain scales. How many names have we forgotten, even as we survive on the systems they built? And what if legacy isn't in what we remember, but in what quietly continues, long after the ink dries. Let's give our thoughts a moment to settle, because next we'll journey north to a kingdom built not on wheat or whispers, but ice, salt, and an unthinkably dull royal obsession. Are you ready to begin Story 4?
Of course. Let's transition now into our final story of the night. A little colder, a little stiffer, but still rich with the texture of lives long buried beneath official records and frost-bitten royal duties. Story 4. The Salt King's Obsession, Bureaucracy, Ice, and the Cold Grip of Power in Denmark, 1502 to 1523. By the turn of the 16th century, the northern seas had grown heavy with ships. Hanseatic cogs creaked under the weight of salted cod. Norwegian vessels lined the fjords with barrels of herring. And in Copenhagen's frigid harbours, Danish customs agents counted and taxed everything from fur to flax, but above all else, salt. Hey guys, tonight we travel not through fire and war, but through ice, cracked and powdered, freezing wind tearing across the Øresund Strait, and long, dark winters where a barrel of salt meant the difference between feasting and famine. Our story begins with one of the strangest monarchs of the early modern world, a man so obsessed with control that he tried to ration the ocean. Literally. His name was King Christian II of Denmark, but don't be fooled by the title. He wasn't the warrior type. He didn't lead great battles. He wasn't known for charm or glory. No, Christian ruled with paperwork. He recorded everything. Fish weight by month, salt output by village, the number of pickling barrels stored in coastal warehouses during especially icy springs. He was not a romantic king. He was a clerk with a crown. And in the early 1500s, that made him terrifying. You probably won't survive this if you're hoping for royal banquets or gallant knights. This is a tale about ration tables, grain rot, bureaucratic paranoia, and a king who measured loyalty in weight per barrel. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and your local time down.
In the comments, I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It started in the winter of 1502. Copenhagen froze over earlier than expected. Fishermen were stranded, unable to bring in their hauls, and the city's preserved fish reserves, herring, eels, small Arctic cod, began to run low. Worse still, the imported salt from Lüneburg and Bremen was delayed by frozen harbours and trade disputes. Salt, you see, wasn't just a spice. It was survival. In a time before refrigeration, every bit of food security relied on salt preservation. Meat, fish, even winter vegetables were buried in brine to last through months where nothing grew and seas were too dangerous to cross. King Christian, not yet crowned but already wielding authority, was a man who noticed things. And what he noticed, as 1502 wore on, was how badly his court and his kingdom was organized. So he began to count. He summoned every salt merchant to court, demanded coastal town registrars deliver full inventories of stored salt, preserved goods, brined fish quantities, and expected consumption rates. It sounds boring, and it was, but the effect was massive. Within 3 months, every major Danish port had a salt officer assigned by the crown. These were not noblemen. They were clerks, men trained not in war, but in math. The kingdom's ledgers exploded in size. Some entries from February 1503 survive. Corsair, 87 barrels cod, 11 dry, 76 brined, 3.1 tons sea salt, expected shortfall, 2.3 tons. Nyborg, no fresh catches reported. Barrels stored, 42, herring. Salt officer recommends redistributing 7 barrels to Svendborg due to aging population.
This was the kind of detail Christian wanted. To him, salt was power. Control the salt, and you controlled not only food, but compliance. You see, people listened to swords when they had to, but they listened to bread and fish when they wanted to. And Christian figured out early that rations worked better than threats. The Salt Decrees. By 1504 he issued the first of what became known as the Salt Dom Orders, a set of royal decrees that mandated crown oversight of all salt imports, regardless of origin. Standardized salt usage per village based on population and climate. Created punishment protocols for excessive brining, a crime that meant preserving more than your assigned quota. Yes, that's right. In Denmark under Christian II, preserving too much food could become a form of treason. And not in some metaphorical, we dislike this kind of way. We're talking public trial, loss of land, and sometimes even imprisonment. There are records from 1506 of two fishmongers in Aalborg who were jailed for hoarding barrels of brined trout during a mild winter, claiming they had expected worse. Christian didn't care. In his view, over-preparedness by individuals disrupted the balance he was trying to enforce. Balance was everything. He didn't want panic. He didn't want chaos. He wanted measured compliance, which meant no more, but also no less, than your assigned salt ratio. And here's where things get even stranger. Ice as a measurement tool. In 1507, Christian implemented what may be the world's first weather-adjusted food policy. He began requiring every salt officer to record average frost depth per week, wind direction and speed, duration of daylight, barrel spoilage rate by temperature. Using these, he created a sliding scale of salt allocation based on winter severity. A colder month, you could preserve more. A milder one, you were expected to consume fresh and reduce your salt use. It was wildly complex. It drove merchants mad. But it worked. From 1508 to 1514, Denmark experienced near-record population growth, due in part to its relatively stable food supplies compared to Sweden and parts of the German north. Christian was lauded not for glory, but for order. Till resentment simmered, salt and rebellion. In 1517, a rebellion flared in Jutland, not over taxes or land, but over a particularly harsh enforcement of salt quotas during a warm winter. Salt officers were accused of lying to the crown to curry favour and restricting local preservation despite a thriving herring season. When Christian sent troops to suppress the protest, many expected executions. Instead, he did something different. He sent clerks. He opened the royal archives and publicly audited the Jutland salt records in front of angry townspeople. The result? Several salt officers were found guilty of false reporting. Their ledgers had been manipulated to reflect shortages that did not exist, funneling excess salt into private warehouses for later sale. Christian had them imprisoned, their estates seized, and then, to everyone's surprise, he increased Jutland's salt allotment by 11%. This was Christian at his core, merciless to corruption, but fiercely loyal to his own system, even when the system turned on him. As this first part of our final story closes, we're left with a cold kingdom ruled not by fire or blood, but by weight, weather, and the unwavering belief that every ounce must be accounted for. But what happens when the man holding the scales starts to lose his balance? What happens when the system becomes more important than the people it was designed to feed? Let's pick that up in the next section. We resume in the year 1519. The ice comes early that year, thick and unkind. Salt imports slow to a crawl. In Copenhagen, King Christian II sits at a long table lined not with courtiers but with scrolls, warehouse reports, brining logs, frost depth estimates, and complaints from fishermen along the Skagerrak coast. The room is silent except for the scratching of quills and the occasional hiss of oil lamps. He is not bored. He is focused. He believes, in the marrow of his bones, that this is how you keep a kingdom alive, with numbers, not with pageantry. But outside the royal offices, things are starting to crack. Let's look closely now, slowly, at what happens when good intentions freeze over. The weight of data. By 1520, Christian's Salt Office isn't just a department, it's a kingdom within a kingdom. With over 60 officers stationed in every major town and fishing port, each one now reports weekly, not monthly. Clerks from the Royal Chancery begin producing salt usage graphs, hand-drawn charts measuring seasonal consumption across population bands. Each report is reviewed personally by Christian. Yes, personally. Even as king, Christian the Coup insists on combing through weekly logs, notations, and temperature reports. He cross-references barrel counts with merchant ship manifests. If discrepancies appear, he summons the local officer by name. He issues handwritten reprimands. He adjusts allocations by decimal points. The man is obsessed. But to Christian, this is not madness. This is governance. This is how one prevents chaos, by never letting go. Of course, real life is never quite so cooperative. In a village called Skelsker, a salt warehouse roof collapses under snowfall, ruining 27 barrels of stock. The local officer reports the loss, but Christian accuses him of intentional mismanagement and reduces their winter allotment as punishment. The result? B.E. February 1520, half the village is surviving on dried kale and frozen rye bread. People begin to whisper, "We starve because our king loves numbers more than mouths." And yet, famine does not break out, not fully. Because even now the machine, flawed as it is, functions. Christian's system keeps most Danes alive, albeit thin, cold, and angry. The Stockholm bloodbath, the Salt King, however, wasn't just a Danish ruler. By a twist of inheritance and political chess, Christian the Coup also lays claim to Sweden, part of the Kalmar Union. In November of 1520, he arrives in Stockholm for his coronation. But there's trouble. Tensions with Swedish nobles boil over, fueled in part by Christian's deeply unpopular tax and resource regulations. Though less known to the public, salt officers had begun operating in Swedish port towns as early as 1517, sparking bitter resentment among merchants and fishermen. Sweden doesn't want spreadsheets. Sweden wants sovereignty. And then, over 3 days in November, Christian's desire for control takes a brutal, irreversible turn. He orders the execution of over 80 Swedish nobles and clergy, accusing them of treason. It becomes known as the Stockholm bloodbath. The man who ruled by ink now rules by blood. And for the first time, the world looks at Christian not as a meticulous governor, but as a tyrant. The backlash is immediate. Sweden rises in revolt. And Christian, he retreats, not to the battlefield, but to the books. He doubles down on order. The collapse of trust. Back in Denmark, word of the bloodbath spreads. Christian, seeing threats at every turn, begins purging his own salt office. He claims corruption. He reassigns coastal clerks. He accuses officers of stockpiling, of falsifying spoilage rates. Dozens are removed. Many are imprisoned. A few disappear altogether. A climate of fear seeps into the administrative, ranks. By 1522, record-keeping becomes erratic. Some towns begin forging their own logs just to avoid punishment. Inventories are padded. Bad barrels are relabeled as acceptable. Whole fishing villages begin lying upward, claiming they've preserved more than they have, just to secure larger allotments. It becomes the very chaos Christian had hoped to prevent. He had designed a system to create balance. Now it devours itself in a spiral of fear-based data inflation. The ledgers lie, the salt rots, and Christian refuses to see it. Icebound and isolated, by early 1523, Denmark is cold again. Ice locks the ports for weeks.
the Lübeck merchants refused to send salt shipments without repayment for overdue loans from the crown. Christian's system cracks. Salt reserves plummet. Fish can't be preserved. Grain fails due to damp spring rot. And now, no one trusts the numbers. Even the loyal officers start submitting conflicting reports, some to appease the king, others to reflect desperate reality. And Christian? He barricades himself in the royal offices, issuing daily directives, revising maps, questioning everyone. He accuses his own chancellors of statistical betrayal. His queen pleads with him to stop. His advisors urge him to loosen control. But Christian cannot. Because Christian believes, truly, that if he lets go of the system, the whole kingdom will die. That without salt quotas, barrel logs and brining thresholds, Denmark will collapse into famine and rebellion. He is both wrong and heartbreakingly right. In April 1523, Christian II is deposed, not by sword, but by the weight of his own bureaucracy. The nobles of Denmark, joined by rebellious Jutland merchants and towns, declare his uncle, Frederick V, as king. Christian flees to the Netherlands, carrying with him only what he deems essential: maps, ledgers, and a small locked chest of salt records from 1502 to 1522. He lives in exile for decades, obsessed still with reforming his system, hoping to return. He never does. And yet, the irony. His obsession, his painful, precise, inhuman salt regime, becomes the foundation for Denmark's future administrative state. Under Frederick and later kings, salt regulation is rebuilt, not with terror, but with transparency. The Salt Office evolves. The logs become cleaner, more accountable. Later Danish governance models adopt many of Christian's frameworks, adjusted, softened, but undeniably his. His name is cursed in Swedish songs. But in Danish record-keeping, he is everywhere. And so, we close this chapter on the king who tried to conquer winter, one barrel at a time. Let me ask, is it madness to believe in order above all? Or was Christian simply too early, too rigid, too cold? For a system that may have worked, if only it had left space for warmth. The year is 1532. Christian II sits in a modest chamber in the fortress of Sønderborg Castle, where he's been imprisoned for nearly a decade. Once a king, now a relic. The room is bare. Its single window lets in little light. But it's quiet, safe even. And in a cabinet beside his cot are the tools that once built a kingdom. Inkpots, quills, stacks of ledgers, old dry pages of salt records from 1503, yellowed and curling. He still reads them, carefully, methodically, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently, always with the reverence of a man leafing through scripture. There is no throne here, no court, no officials, only numbers, barrels, frost depths, catches, losses, salt, bureaucracy in captivity. By now, Denmark has moved on. King Frederick III reigns. Christian's old salt office has been dismantled and rebuilt, this time under the authority of a rotating council of merchants and lords. The harsh quotas are gone. In their place, negotiated trade allowances with local autonomy restored in port towns. Denmark begins to thrive slowly, warming to a gentler kind of order. But Christian, he still believes the system worked. In his long letters, many never sent, he pleads with his captors to review the original intent. He copies old barrel logs by hand, annotating them with comments like, Feb 1509, sea ice reports misfiled. True frost did not exceed 1.4 cubits. Adjustment needed in Nyborg salt allotment. He drafts a 200-page treatise on the method of brine sovereignty, proposing a reformed, humane version of his policies. No one reads it. It remains stacked, untouched, on a wooden shelf for years. He has become not a king, but a ghost clerk, haunting the prison halls with the echoes of a kingdom that counted too much and cared too little. A legacy in the shadows. Outside the prison walls, time moves forward. By the 1540s, Denmark has entered a new era. A Lübeck trade wanes, and Dutch merchants bring fresh salt into the markets. Brining continues, still essential for survival in cold months, but now as a choice, not a command. Still, quietly, many of Christian's innovations remain. Seasonal ration logs, centralized trade reports, weather-based planning models, salt standardization measures, they're no longer wielded with severity. But the skeleton of the system, its cool logic, its mathematical foresight, remains intact. Historians of the 17th century begin to refer to Christian II not as the tyrant, but as the administrator king. His failures are acknowledged, but so is his singular contribution. He was the first Scandinavian monarch to attempt a scientific model of governance, long before modern public health, before central statistics offices, before climate data and supply chains. Christian had tried, and yes, he failed, often painfully, sometimes cruelly, but the world eventually grew into the kind of place he was trying to build. It just didn't happen in his lifetime. A final record. Christian II died in 1559 at the age of 77, still in custody. A quiet deathbed entry survives in the prison chaplain's log. His Majesty passed peacefully, murmuring figures in sleep. Something about barrels and frost. His burial was simple. But beside his body, among the few items permitted to remain in his cell, was a final sheet of parchment. A table of monthly salt allocations. Blank. Each column neatly drawn, each row labelled by town, empty, waiting. It was perhaps his last attempt to bring structure to a world that refused to stay still. So here we are, at the end of our final tale tonight. Not with a crash of swords or clash of empires, but with a ledger, a barrel, a winter, a man who tried to save his people from hunger and ended up starving them of freedom. And maybe that's the cue. What question this story leaves behind. Is it worse to fail because you were careless, or because you cared too much? Sleep well, friend. You've just made it through 2 full hours of the most quietly dramatic frozen fish-based bureaucracy history ever knew. And I hope you enjoyed the slow unraveling of these lives, lost not to war or fame, but to cold nights, strange plans, and the patient grinding of forgotten time.